All right, so in this tutorial, we're going to talk through a couple of different things. The first one is going to be just your render settings in general. So we're going to talk through a couple of different basic render settings and how you can make some adjustments. We're going to be using Maya software for this tutorial, which is kind of like a preloaded little rendering engine that's part of Maya for you. And then after render settings, we're going to talk about how to set up UV maps. So we're going to talk on a very basic level planar mapping and kind of do it in a way like the old-fashioned way. So Maya has created a bunch of new tools which will really speed up your UV mapping process. But the hope is to kind of teach it at a basic level for right now so that you understand kind of the bare bones of how it works. And then later on in some other tutorials, we'll talk about some of the newer tools that are available to you so that you can speed that process up. Once we apply some UV textures, we'll talk about how to paint a texture onto one of your objects in Photoshop. And then after that, we'll take that, we'll add in a basic light and talk about how to make some quick adjustments to shadows and just talk lighting real quick as well. So that's kind of what's on the plate for today. So there's a couple of things I want to go through. So we'll start out just by making a new project. I want to do this so that we can save our textures in the same spot. So I'm going to go to File and down to Project window. In here, I'm going to create a new, and I'm going to call it last name, and then we will just call it kind of tutorial. You can change the location of where this is saving. I'm going to put it right on my desktop. Once you do that, you can leave the rest of the defaults and you can just click accept. Okay, so then I'm going to save my first scene. So I'm going to go to File, Save Scene As, Power, Tutorial, and I'll save it as 01, and save. All right, so now we have our blank scene in here. I want to put a plane down to act as kind of a floor, and then we'll put a cube on top of the plane. So I'm just going to create a plane first, and I will scale that up by pressing R. Once I have that scaled up, I'm going to rename that floor. And then I'm going to turn my grid off. So you can press this little grid button over on your viewport, and that will turn off your grid. And I also turned on my wireframe on shaded, which was right here. Okay, and then I'm going to create a cube. So I'm going to click the cube button, and I will press F to zoom into that cube and kind of pull that up so that it sits right on top of the floor, and you can just kind of guess, just get it close. So that looks good. I'm going to put 3 subdivisions on each side. So if I go over to my channel box, under inputs, I can click that polycube 1, put a 3 in all of the subdivisions. And then I also want to rename that cube. So I'll just call it, rather than P cube 1, we'll call it cube test. Okay. So we have our cube here, and we also have our floor plan. So I want to create a camera because later we're going to do some test renders and see what changing some lighting attributes will do. So I want to set up a camera so that we can use that same camera angle each time. So I'm going to go to Create, go down to Cameras, and just click Camera. And then I'm just going to kind of roughly move this. I'm just going to place this kind of looking straight down at my cube from this kind of off to the side here a little bit. So if I go into Panels, Perspective, and click this Camera 1 button, that's going to be that new camera that we just created. The PERSP, that's our perspective view, which Maya kind of automatically will set us in. So if I click on the camera, you can see that now we are actually controlling that camera. And I'm just going to kind of roughly change my view here to be more something like this for right now. Over in my channel box, I'm also going to rename that camera, and I'm going to call it Render Cam. And then I can go back to my perspective view. So I'll go back by Panels, Perspective, and go back to that perspective view. And you can see that Maya has kind of moved that camera around for us here, which is nice. Okay, so the next step is to just talk through some of these render settings a little bit here. So if I go up to my render settings, and you can find that up on this top toolbar over towards the right hand side, you're going to see that little film guy with the blue wheel in the bottom right corner. If you just click on that, that will load up your render settings. Depending on your version of Maya and some of the plugins that you have, you may have some other render using engines in here. So I have just Maya software and Maya hardware in this program right now. But if you have other options, that's fine too. Today we are just going to really talk through Maya software, so I'm going to leave that selected. Some other changes that I want to make: if you scroll down here, this first file output section, if we were going to do a batch render, which means that we would be rendering out more than one frame at a time, we would want to make our changes in this file output. You could change what your image format is. You can change the naming extension right here, and so forth. If you were to make changes up here, it would also trigger this next field to not be grayed out. So your frame range, you could type in what you want your start frame to be and what your end frame is. By frame would probably just be at 1. And then underneath that, this is where I do want to make one of my changes. So where I have renderable cameras, I want to change that renderable camera to just be my render cam. That's why we created it. And underneath that, we have our image size. So right now, mine's preset at this HD 540. I'm just going to bump that up to HD 720. And I'll leave the rest the same. If you were doing a render that you were actually going to really be using, you may want to bump up the resolution as well. But since we're just really using this for a test and a tutorial, I'll leave that at just 72 for my resolution. So then up on the top, you can see a couple of different tabs. This is our common tab. This will look pretty much the same no matter what rendering engine we're using. But if I click the Maya software button that's right there, this will allow me to make some changes based on the engine that I'm using. So my quality here, I had set it custom. I'm going to change that to be production quality, and that'll just help us for today. That will make some automatic adjustments, but I'm going to scroll down a little bit. The only other thing I want to make sure is checked on is this ray tracing quality. If I open that up, you can see mine is currently turned off. I just want to click on our ray tracing. Ray tracing is what we're going to use to generate our shadows later on when we kind of add in some of those basic lights. So you just want to turn that on so that we don't have to worry about it later. And then you can just close out of your render settings. We'll leave everything else the same for now. Okay. So the next thing that we want to talk about is just how to set up some planar mapping. So we are going to set up UV maps on our cube. A UV map is really like an onion skin that wraps around your object. And what it does is it's a way for us to kind of paint textures on. So if you were to think of like a t-shirt that you're wearing, it kind of sits on top of your skin. It sits on top of you, which would be our object if we were thinking in Maya terms. And our t-shirt could be removed, but we can change what it looks like. We can change the color of it. We can change the texture of it. We can change the writing of it and everything like that. And in reality, it just sits on top of us, but it also has seams to it. So any type of UV map that we're going to be creating will wrap around whatever our polygon is. So for our example right now, we have a cube. Our UV map will wrap around our cube. We'll be able to then put a texture on top of it, which will project onto our cube. But we will need to have a seam. So if you were to think in terms of a t-shirt, you know that a seam is normally going to happen down the side of your t-shirt, right underneath your armpit. That's kind of where they've decided to hide that. So as a 3D modeler or as a texture artist, you need to decide where you want to try and hide your seam as well. So if you were to think of, if you got like a Coke bottle out of a vending machine, and on that you could take off the label and you could kind of lay it flat. But then you could also just roll it back up and you could wrap it around that Coke bottle. That's really what we're going to be creating as far as a UV map would be. It would be that label which wraps around that Coke bottle. It gives it its look, it gives it its style. But in reality, we could take it off, we could lay it down flat, and it can lay down flat because it has that seam in the back where it kind of sticks together to form that one cylindrical shape. So that's roughly what we're going to be creating today, except we're going to do it on a cube because it'll be fairly simple for us to explain how this process works. With UV mapping, it may not make a ton of sense right away. That's okay. We're going to do a couple more tutorials with it, and the more you practice it, the more you'll start to understand exactly what you're looking for and exactly what a a strong UV layout will be. So let's jump into it. The first thing we're going to need to do is apply a shader onto our cube. So with my cube selected here, I'm going to right click. Down on the bottom of that menu, you can see where it says Assign New Material. I'm going to select that. And I'm going to put a blend, which for me is the second shader down. I'm going to select blend, and it'll apply that blend right onto my cube. Over in my attribute editor now, you can see where it says blend 1. I'm going to select that. And here I'm going to rename this blend. I'm going to call it a cube TXT for cube texture. And then underneath that, you can see some of those other options that we've talked about already. So you've got your color and you've got all those other little changes in there as well. When we talked shaders, that's when we went through this. We're now going to add another layer onto the shader so that we can start projecting an image. So where it says color right here, over on the right, you've got this little checkerboard pattern. If I were to select that checkerboard pattern, it should load up this new menu. It's this Create Render Node menu. On here, the second option down is checker. So if I click checker, it won't look like anything has really happened. But if I close that menu out, and in my viewport, if I click 6, oh, 1 second, let me just make sure I did that correct. There we go. Okay, so I must not have clicked my checker before. If you click checker and then you go in and you click 6, 6 will then show your textures on your viewport. So if I were to select 5, it would take those textures off, and 6 will turn them back on. So those are some options that we're going to be using today. I'm going to leave the checker pattern on because right now we've now created this new texture which is sitting on top of our cube. So if I wanted to see what that looked like in our Hypershade editor, which we've looked at through the last tutorial, I could go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and down to Hypershade. And then in here, you can see that cube TXT. It's got this checkerboard pattern. I'm going to right click on it and then go down to Graph Network. What that'll do is it'll load that shader down in my little network on the bottom here. And you can kind of see how it's laid out. So we've got our cube TXT right in the middle here. On the right, you've got our blend. That's that first shader that we applied, and that's our out color. The checker pattern over here on the left is going from the out color to the color on our object. So that's how you want that to be set up. And if that looks correct, you should be able to see your shader, your checker pattern right on top of your cube. And we can start to move forward as far as laying that UV map, that onion skin out over our cube. So I'm going to do an older process which is called planar mapping today. It's a little dated because there's new ways that you can go about doing this, but if we learn it the old-fashioned way, this planar mapping way, it's going to make more sense to you when you start to learn some of the new tools. So that's what we're going to go through today. So the first thing that I need to do is select an entire face an entire side of faces. So I had put 3 subdivisions on this cube, so I have 9 faces per side. So I'm just going to select all 9. Make sure that you've only selected the faces on that side of the cube that you're going to be working on. And then I want to open up on the top, so I'm in modeling right now. I have this UV option. If I click on that, and the first little button that's there is this UV editor. I'm going to open up this UV editor. And this will be a new tool for us, a new menu that we haven't really looked at yet. So let's talk this through real quick. So you can see in my UV editor we have this checker pattern. That checker pattern is there because we've applied that file to our object already. If I didn't want to see that checker pattern in my UV editor, up on the top I could click this little file button and it would turn it off. And now what you can see are a bunch of faces. And you can also see that 9 of them are highlighted. So if you kind of look at my cube over on the left-hand side of my screen and my UV editor at the same time, if I hover over any of these faces on my cube, you can see that that corresponding face is also being highlighted in my UV editor. That's because they are going to control the same exact face. So any face on my model will control a face that's over in my UV editor. The same goes for edges and the same goes for vertices. So everything we've talked about before, you're really going to have those same options in your UV editor. So if I were to select into my UV editor and right click, you can see that we've got our edge tool, our face tool on bottom, and our vertex tool on the left. Now there are 2 other tools in here, a UV shell and a UV, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But right now I just want to look at this one side as far as that checkerboard pattern. So I've got those 9 faces selected. You can see those 9 faces selected in this little editor over here. And then I'm going to go up to UV, and about halfway down you can see where it says planar. I want to select that planar button, and you'll notice that my cube now has a new checkerboard pattern, and it's just a smaller checkerboard pattern that's been projected onto it. It's facing the right direction and it looks pretty good. So over on the right now, if I just kind of minimize that UV editor, over on the right in my normal viewport, in my attribute editor, we've got some new options which have just popped up. We've got our projection center, our rotate, and then our projection width and height. Those are what I really want you to look at for right now. You can leave the projection center. The rotate is working for us right now, and I'll explain why in a little bit. You'll understand that. And then the projection width and height is the first thing I'm going to look at every time. I'm always going to set that for myself to just 1 for each of them for right now. So every time we do a new planar map, go over, make sure that your projection width and your projection height are at 1. If they are, then we can start making other adjustments from there. Now, in my viewport, in my perspective view, you can see this new little editor that has kind of popped up. And it's parallel with this side of faces that we've selected. That means it's facing the right direction. You've got this little blue arrow right here. And you can see that that little blue line is projected and facing right towards that side that we wanted to work on. That means that this UV map is being projected how we want it to be projected, and it looks correct. And we can also tell that because of how clean all of these little cubes look on our object. If you have it looking like that, you can go into your UV editor, and you'll see that it's now created this larger shaded object, and as well it has a move tool in here. So it's got this green handle and this red handle and this little yellow circle in the middle. If I click that yellow circle, I can pull those 9 faces out anywhere else in my grid. It doesn't matter where you put them right now, but just pull them out and you can drop them down. Now you'll also notice that if I move those faces around, it moves the checker pattern over on my cube. And that's because we're just moving how this map is being projected. We're moving which part of that map is there, and we're messing with the UVs. The UVs are what's kind of making that projection for us. So I'm going to leave that over here. I'll leave that alone, and I'll just click off of it. So now, in my viewport, I'm going to go select 9 more faces. So I just selected the next side here. And you can see that those 9 faces were then selected in my UV editor. And I can go to, so you can do this a couple of different ways in order to actually put a projection down. Oh, I just deselected, 1 second. So you can go up to UV and click planar. The other option is to hold down Shift, right click, and go down to mapping. And then you can just do a planar map. So I did that, and this time you'll notice that it looks a little bit different, right? So unlike before where it projected these nice 1 by 1 checkerboard cubes onto my object, this time it looks a little off. We've got this gray in the middle, and the outsides don't look right either, because we want it to look exactly like this other side. The reason it's doing that is because the first thing I notice is that my projection width is at 0. My height is at 1, which is good, but my width is at 0. So I'm going to change that to 1. So now it may look even worse. It doesn't look like there's anything being projected on that side. But if you look, it's because you can tell that this new little axis that's been created is actually perpendicular to our side that we're trying to make this projection on. That's because our rotate angle is off. We need that to project right on top of that side, which means we need it to be parallel. Just like we had before, we had that little blue line that was facing our object. We don't have that now because the axis is pointed the wrong way. So in my attribute editor, where it says rotate, the first thing I'll do is just take that 90 out, and we'll see if that works. So I'm going to set that to 0 and click enter. And you'll see that that made a change, right? So now that looks correct. It looks like that axis is sitting right on top of our plane. Those UVs, this side now looks exactly the same as the other side that we had worked on, which means everything is being projected correctly. So I can load back up my UV editor. You'll notice that I can pull out that same exact shape that we had before, and I'll just rest it up on top next to the other one. And then you can click off, and you can turn this cube around. So now I'll do side number 3. I'm going to go into my face tool, select these 9 faces here. You'll see those 9 faces were then selected in your UV editor. You can hold down Shift and right click, go down to mapping, and do a planar map. This one looks like it was projected correctly already for me, which is great. So I can just grab it, and I can pull it off to the side in my UV editor. So now we've got 3 more sides to do. So we've got this other side here. So let me select these 9 faces. Make sure that you've only got those 9 faces selected in your UV editor. Hold down Shift, right click, go to mapping, and do a planar map. And you'll notice here we're having that same issue that we ran into last time around. So I'm going to change my projection width to 1 because I can see that that's off. And then I'm going to change my rotate angle to that 0, which worked for us before. Since those 2 sides are facing the same direction, those same changes will work. I can then go into my UV editor. I can pull out my 4th side here. Okay. So we've got 2 more sides to do. It's the top and the bottom of our cube. So if I select the top portion here, select those 9 faces, I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to hold down Shift and right click, go down to mapping and do a planar map. It's not working how I want it to work yet, so I need to go make my changes. First thing I notice is that my projection height this time is at 0. I can set that to 1. But it's still not parallel to my side that I'm supposed to be working on. So it's perpendicular. I want that to be parallel. So I can try and make my adjustment with my 90 like I've done before. So let's just try that first. And you can see that that didn't do the trick. So I can just undo that if I wanted to. So what I want to do is I need to rotate this 90 degrees down somehow. So let me just try it in this first rotate option here. I'll put a 90 in and just click enter. And you can see that that's what it needed. So it needed to be rotated 90 degrees down so that it can now run parallel to that side. Those faces look correct. I can load back up my UV editor and I can pull this off. And now I want to go do that same exact thing to the bottom as well. So I'm going to go select the 9 faces on the bottom of this cube, hold down Shift and right click, do a planar map. I know that I just need to make that one change and put this rotate to a 90. And then I need to change my projection height to 1. And now you can see those cubes again. Go to my UV editor, and I can pull that out. So now we've successfully UV mapped our entire cube, which is great. So we can then take these, we can draw textures on them, we can paint on them, and it should project them back onto our cube. But there's one more step that we need to do first. In order to get these images into Photoshop so that we can actually start making changes, we need to take what's called a UV snapshot. In order to take a UV snapshot, we need all of these objects, all of these new little UV shells, they're called, to fit inside of this first grid. So this 1x1 grid that's down here where my checker pattern appears, that is where I need all of these other objects to be. So in order to do that, I want to organize them in a correct manner. I want my 4 faces that are kind of the middle of my cube. So if I were to take out my top and my bottom, those 4 other sides, I want to be able to lay out flat. So like we talked about with a Coke bottle, and if you were to roll that label out, I want that same general idea for those 4 sides of my cube. Right now, if you look in my UV editor, you can see that all 4 of them are disconnected. None of them are working hand in hand or side by side. And you can also tell that because if you zoom in and you look at side by side on your cube, you can see that the checker pattern doesn't match up correctly. It's not lined up in the right spot. The patterns are off-centered a little bit. And I want that to work. I want that to flow the correct way, because if it does, that means that it'll be easier to paint my textures later on. So I need to do what's called moving and sewing some UV edges. So if I look at this first side here, if I were to go into this and I hover over any of these edges, you'll notice that it's also selecting that edge in my UV editor. So I've got 2 edges which are now red in my UV editor, and that's because I've hovered over the edge in the actual object. The reason that 2 of them are showing is because that edge does control 2 different faces, right? I selected a corner, which means that one edge is controlling 2 separate faces. If I were to select this entire row, you'll now see that in my UV editor, this edge and this edge are both selected. Those are technically the same exact edge. So I want to move and sew them together so that they play out as one object. So with them selected, I can hold down Shift and I can right click in my UV editor and I can go to Move and Sew Edges. I can let go and you'll notice that it combines those 2. So now those 2 sides, which used to be acting on their own, are connected. And what else it did is it reorganized my checker pattern in my viewport here, and you can kind of see how the checker pattern flows nicely from side to side. And that pattern kind of overlaps itself, which is nice. So if I just undo, you can see what it looked like before, and you can just look at kind of this white checker up on top. And then if I were to move and sew, you'll see the difference that it makes. You want to do that for all 4 of those sides in the middle, because that'll help us lay out that one flat texture, which we can then rewrap around our cube. So we'll just look at one of the other sides, right? So we did this side here. So if I were to move on and say I want to do this next side, which would be this one right here, I select all 3 of those, and if I look in my UV editor, you can see it's selected those 6 edges, which is great because that's what we want. But the issue is that these edges aren't, they're facing the same direction right now. So if I were to actually go into Move and Sew, you'll notice that what it did is it actually combined, or it put one side on top of the other side. And that's going to cause us issues if we try and paint a texture on this, because it would paint that same texture on both sides. We want it to actually lay out and just be combined like our previous one was, so that I can still see all 9 of these faces and all 9 of these faces, rather than if I move and sew them right now, it's going to plop that object on top of each other. So in reality, I need this group of edges here to be on this side so that they can just connect. In order to do that, what you need to do is flip those UVs around. So if I right click and I go to UV and I just drag a box around this UV shell. So a UV shell is any of these individualized objects. So if I were to just go to UV shell real quick, I right click, I can go to UV shell. You can see that I can hover over an entire side. It'll turn it red, and it'll also turn those faces red out in my viewport. So this is its own UV shell. This is its own UV shell. All two sides here, since we connected these together and we moved and sewed, that is acting as one UV shell. And then I've got my top, which is a UV shell here, and my bottom, which is a UV shell. But we need to just move the UVs for right now. So I've gone into my UV mode. UVs kind of act as vertices. They look like vertices. They're on the edges. I can drag a box around those UVs. And I want to flip them horizontally so that the edges switch sides and now will line up with the corresponding edge that I need them to connect with. So by holding down Shift and right-clicking, I can then go to Flip, which is the second option down, and I want to go into this little option box over on the side. If I select that, you can see the direction. I can either flip these horizontally or vertically. I need these to go horizontal because I need the left side to go to the right side. So I can leave that as horizontal and just click Apply and Close. So it won't look like anything really happened because this is just a cube, but in reality now, if I go into my edge mode and I select this edge again, you'll notice that it's now this edge here is lined up correctly with the edge next to it. I can sew those two things together and they'll then act as one edge. So with those selected, I can hold down Shift and right click and go to Move and Sew Edges, and it'll combine those, and it'll also clean up that checker pattern out on my cube over here and make sure everything flows correctly. All right, so we've got one more side to do. So if I were to take a look and just go to my next side here, it looks like it's right here. So if I select all three of those edges, you'll notice that we're having that same issue as before. So our edges are currently facing opposite directions. I need them to be right next to each other so that I can easily move and sew and keep this pattern correct. So I'm going to right click on this UV shell here, go to UV, I'll drag that bounding box around it and make sure everything's selected. Hold down Shift and right click. And this time I can just select Flip since I already know it's flipping horizontally. Let that go. And then I can go to Edge, select those three edges, hold down Shift, right click, and go to Move and Sew. So now, if I go to my UV shell and I select this entire object, you'll see that all four of those sides are working out. And then we've still got the top and the bottom, which are acting as separate pieces. So that is your rough demonstration of how to do some really basic planar mapping and how to move and sew your objects around in the UV editor. You can do other things in the UV editor as well. You know, we've talked about the Move tool. It's the same thing. If you just click W, you'll get your Move tool up. You can scale in the UV editor. So if I click R, you can scale any of those objects, which we will have to do in a little bit. And you can also rotate them. So if I click E, I can rotate those UVs around. And if I hold down J as I rotate, it'll snap it. So that'll help you out if you need to be on an exact number. Okay. So like I mentioned before, in order for me to actually paint textures on top of these, I need to take that UV snapshot. And in order to take that UV snapshot, I need all of these objects, all of these shells, to be in this first little grid. So if I turn that file back on, you can see my checker pattern down here. I can now move these objects and put them down inside of that little checker pattern grid so that I can make textures on them and get something going. So I'm going to click R. I'm going to scale this down a little bit. Then I'll click W, and I'm just going to move it into this little grid. I'll then select both of my other objects, scale those down too, and I can plug them in there as well. So now if I zoom in, you can kind of see what we're working with. I'm going to turn off that file real quick. So I need all of these to sit inside of this grid right here, which they are. But I also want them to be as big as possible, because the bigger that they are, the better resolution that we'll have and the more room we'll have to apply those textures. So something like this will work out fine for us for what we need right now. Everything is inside of these grid lines, which is great. And now I need to take what's called a UV snapshot. You can see that by making those scale changes, it's adjusted what's happened to our checker pattern on our cube. That's fine, that's normal. That'll all work itself out because we're going to get rid of that checker pattern anyways once we start painting textures on it. Okay, so I need to select my object in object mode. So if I press Q or I right click on it, I can go to my object mode and just make sure your object is selected. If you ever deselect it, you'll notice that it disappears in your UV editor. Your UV editor is always going to show what you have selected. So if I select my cube, I can now see my UVs back. Up on the top, you have your little menu in here. You can see where it says image. If I select image and go down to UV snapshot, it will create this new UV snapshot, which is just going to really be a screenshot of that one grid pattern that we can pull into Photoshop and paint a texture on top of. It should be saving your file inside of your images folder in your project, which you created. I created my project, called it Bauer_tutorial, and then this UV snapshot will save in the images folder. For size, it's up to you if you want to leave it as is or you want to bump that up, you can. I'm going to bump it up just to 1024. I'll just double what it had, what it was originally using. You can change the image format. I'll just do a JPEG for this, but if it's on something else, you can do a bunch of different formats if you need to. And then from there, once you have all that selected, you can just click OK. So now I can minimize my UV editor. I'm going to save my Maya scene, and I can minimize my Maya scene. And now I want to go into my project. So in my project, I saved it on my desktop. It's right here called Bauer Tutorial. I can double click, and I've got some different options. One of these folders is the images folder. And inside of the images folder, you should see this out UV. That is our UV snapshot, which we just took. If I take that, I then want to load it into Photoshop. So I have already loaded up Photoshop here. I'm just going to grab this out UV and drag it into Photoshop. So now you can see that exact layout that we had. All of those UV shells that we were talking about are showing up in Photoshop. And anything that I paint onto this texture will then appear on our object in the same spot that that corresponding face is located. So right now you can see the background is completely black, and I can also see this grid line. In reality, I don't need to see this grid line when I'm actually going to apply this texture. So I'm going to create a new layer in Photoshop. If you go to the bottom right hand corner, you can create a new layer. And that new layer, I'm just going to draw some textures onto it. So I'm going to go to my brush tool. It looks like I've got a red selected. I'll just change that to like a blue. And I'm just going to paint a texture. So I'm just going to write that I love UVs. And that will be this great texture that I want to apply to my cube. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put a white background on it because I also want my cube to be white. So I'm going to create another layer. I'll bump it underneath layer 1. And on here, I'm going to use the paint bucket tool, change my color to white, and just drop that color right in. So now you can see that that grid, our UV snapshot, is completely hidden. That's what I want it to be. I don't need to see that UV snapshot when I create this final image. So I'm just going to draw a couple of more things on the top and the bottom here. I don't want to do it in white or it won't show up. Let me get my purple or blue back and just do some squiggly lines. I'll put this layer back. And what I'm saying is that I want this exact image to show up on my cube back in Maya. In order for that to happen, I need to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this in my Source Images folder. It should already load up your project. I'm going to go to my Source Images folder, and I can call this whatever I want. I'm going to call it my Cube UV. You can change the format or the file type. I'm going to move it. I'll just do a PNG, and then you can just click Save. Once you've done that, you can minimize Photoshop and bump Maya back open so that we have our little cube here. So we can't see the texture yet. We can still just see that checker pattern. So we need to get rid of that checker pattern before we can apply our texture. If I go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade, like we looked at before in Hypershade, we have our checker pattern. If I select that checker pattern, I can just delete it and it'll now throw that away. I can then just close out of my Hypershade menu. I don't need it here. And you can see that my cube does not have a texture again. That's because we just took it off. So with my cube selected, over in your attribute editor, you want to go find that cube TXT that we had created earlier. It's probably going to be all the way on the right. If you just want to use the little arrow buttons and get all the way to the right, you can click cube TXT. So again, if you select your cube, over on the right, be in your attribute editor, and just press your little arrow button all the way until you see your blend shader that you had created earlier. For me, I renamed it cube TXT. In here, same process as we did before. That little checker pattern that's next to the color, I want to select. And then I'm going to go, this time, rather than selecting checker, I'm going to create a file, which is the fourth one down on my screen. So you click File, and it looks like it just kind of grays out our cube a little bit more. Now I need to actually load my image into that file. So over on the right, it should load up your image name and then this little manila folder. If you select that manila folder, it should open up your source images folder already because we've set our project. And you can select that cube UV and just click open. And if you've already pressed 6, you can see that we now have that texture which has been applied, and then we've got our little squiggly lines up on the top and the bottom, which is working out pretty well for us. So that's good. It looks like I actually did mine reverse, so you can see it's the I love UVs and it's going the wrong way, but that's okay because at least it was still able to just apply that texture for us and we can see what this image looks like. So if that works for you, that's great. That means you've been able to apply a file or a painted texture onto one of your objects in Maya. That is what we were hoping to do for the first part of this tutorial today, so I hope that that worked out. If it didn't, there could be a bunch of different reasons why. You really just want to make sure that you're applying it to the correct shader. So you want to go into that blend that you had been using and then create a file and load up your image from there. That's important. You also want to make sure you have 6 turned on. If you're on 5, you won't see your textures. So if you have 6 on, you will. That could be another issue that's kind of throwing you off here too. That's our basic introduction to UVs. So UVs are extremely important. They're helpful. This is the old painful process. We're going to do some more with this later on in this kind of lesson. And then eventually we'll get into how to create UVs much quicker and much more efficient. But you'll understand them better if you learn them this way first. So if you remember back, we had created our camera at the beginning of this entire process. If I go into my panels, perspective, and into my render cam, I've still got my camera here. Earlier, I had created in my render settings that I wanted this to work in HD 720. If I want to see exactly what a render will look like, I can go to View, camera settings, and resolution gate. Now you'll see that I get this grayed out area. What's inside of that is exactly what my HD 720 aspect ratio will look like, and that's exactly what a rendered image would be too. So if I were to actually just render this out right now, I haven't set any lights up or anything like that, but if I were to go up to render, which is this button up on the top, it's the second one in, close to where our render settings was, and I click it, and I'm on Maya software still, you'll see that I get this basic image. It's got a little bit of like a pre-lit shadow in there and everything like that because we turned our mental ray or our ray tracing options on earlier. And you can see my little texture in there. I'm going to save this image so we can see what type of adjustments we're going to make moving forward. So in order to save an image, you can go up to the top, and there's this little file button with this blue square around it. If you click that, it'll save that image just inside of your Maya render view. You can then close that out. And now I want to add in a light, and I want to see what this looks like with a light. So I'm going to go to Create, Lights, and the first light that we're going to create is just a point light. So if I click point light and click W, you'll notice that a point light is going to be dropped right in the middle of our cube. If you click 7, 7 will show you a render preview or a preview of what's going on with basic lighting. So right now, my box is completely dark now, and you can't see anything that's happening. That's because my point light is right inside of it. So it's lighting up the inside of my box, but it's not able to get to the outside. If I move that point light, you can see the different changes that it's going to make. So if you want it to light up two sides, you need to move it more in the middle here. If I wanted the top to be lit up as well, I got to pull that up. And you can kind of see the differences that the point light is going to be making. So if I pull the point light back a little bit and then up, and I'll just kind of put it in this rough spot here. Over on the right, you've got a couple of options. So the first thing you can do is you can change the color of your light. If you needed to change the color of your light, you want it to be blue so it's a little more natural, you can do that, all in your attribute editor over on the right hand side. I'm going to leave mine white for right now. You can also change the intensity level. I could bump that way up, or I could turn it way down if I needed it to be a dimmer light. So you have that option as well. I'll just set it back to 1 for here. If I were to actually click the render button, we can see what this new image will look like with a light. So now if I click save, you can kind of see the difference. So this was our original, just kind of the standard Maya setup without any lights. And this is what we get when we add that point light in. It's kind of looking down on top of our cube. So that is kind of what a point light can do. Point lights are helpful. I don't use them a ton, to be honest with you, but they can do some really nice things, especially if you're trying to set up like a desk lamp or something along that sort, and you just need it to kind of have that circular glow. A point light is a good option for you. There's not a ton of changes you can make with point lights, but they can be really helpful. You can turn down their intensity if you need them to be a little bit dimmer, and they can help with adding some mood lighting and that sort of thing into your scene. I'm going to delete that point light, and I'm going to go to Create, Lights, and I'm going to do a directional light this time. So here, you'll notice that the directional light is lighting up this one side of my box. If I pull the directional light out, you can see what it looks like. It's just these 3 arrows. Those 3 arrows, if I move them up and down, you can see that nothing is happening. It doesn't look like anything's happening in my scene. And if I move them left and right, it also doesn't look like anything's happening. That's because the directional light doesn't really have a starting point and an ending point. The directional light is going to just take up your entire scene, and it's going to send a beam of light from left to right, or if you're at an angle, from wherever it is. But it's not going to end. It's not going to have that starting point or that restriction, that limitation, like a point light would have had. So a directional light, in order to change how that's going to affect your scene, you would actually need to rotate it. So if I wanted to rotate it down, you can see what type of changes it makes. If I pull it back up, now that light is not touching any other side of my cube. It's just directly straight on into just this one part that my little heart is. If I bump that down, you can see some of those other changes that it's making. You can do the same thing with directional light. You can change the color and the intensity of it. And let's kind of roughly see what this looks like in our render. So this is what our directional light's looking like. You can see that longer shadow that's kind of taking place here. If I save that image, you can see what we have. So our first one was just a basic preview. Second one was our point light. Third one was our directional light. And you can kind of see the changes that are happening. What's nice about the point light, you've got a little bit more of a gradient, kind of a decay rate in your background or in our plane that's here. It's a little bit darker up top compared to where our point light started. The directional light, you're not going to get that. It's going to keep that flat image everywhere else, except it's just going to brighten up whatever you have it pointed right at. So that's two options. The third option, if I go to Create, let me delete my directional light first. If I go to Create, Lights, and Spotlight, I can now use a spotlight. And you guys should be somewhat familiar with spotlights. It's like what you'd see at like an auditorium or anything like that. So if I were to move my spotlight, and let me actually get into my perspective view here for a second. You can kind of see what the spotlight is going to be doing. So I pulled it up and I'm going to rotate it down like this. And you can see that the spotlight here is acting like any other spotlight. It has that, that cone shape. It's got a pretty hard edge right now, and it's really just saying if you were at an auditorium or anything like that, they shine that spotlight down on you, that's exactly how this is going to be acting. You can make some nice changes to your spotlight though. So I've kind of just placed it off to the side. I'm going to go back into my render cam so we can see some of these changes take place. First couple changes, like anything else, you can change the color and the intensity of it. But if I scroll down a little bit more, you can see some other little options for me here. I have my cone angle, which is first. If I bump that up, you can see that my cone is then just going to be that much wider. If I shrink that, you can see that it's going to act as a much thinner cone in a more directionalized light. So I'm going to bump that up a little bit like this for right now. Next one is your penumbra angle. So if you bump up your penumbra angle, it'll soften that edge kind of moving out. If I pull it all the way down, it'll soften that edge kind of pulling back in. So that's one of the nice things about your spotlight, is that you can soften that edge up really nicely. Next part is your drop off. If I bump up my drop off, you can see how much of a change that's really going to make as well. So if I put it all the way at 0, you can see I still have that somewhat soft edge. If I bump my drop off like all the way up, you can really dim that light out and get a really nice look that has a nice decay rate and a nice gradient that's kind of pushing backwards with it. So I'm going to keep my drop off at like 75, and I'll keep my cone angle at around 40 and my penumbra angle at 10, and let's see kind of what this looks like with Maya software. Okay, so now we've got kind of a nicer gradient in the background here, and we've got this harder shadow that's still kind of taking place. I'm going to save this image, and you can see the difference for that compared to some of our other ones. So here was our standard shader. There was nothing, no lighting going on. Next was our point light. You can kind of see what the point light was doing. Next was our directional light. And the directional light just has that really flat background. And last is our spotlight, which is what we're going to kind of talk about a little bit more today, and how to change some shadows. So let's say I generally liked how this background was working. I like that I've got this gradient. The light source is kind of in the front and it's fading out pretty quickly. But I didn't love how hard this shadow was on my cube. And I want to make some changes to that. So I'm going to close this out. I'm going to go into my attribute editor for my light, and I'm going to go down to where it says shadows. Now, Maya software can use two different types of shadows. you can use depth map shadows. So let's just click that on first and we'll see what this looks like. So depth map shadows at a resolution of 512, if I were to render out, isn't going to give the best look. You can see how pixelated that is on all of its edges, and it still has that really hard edge that's on there too. So that doesn't look great, but I'll save that image so we can compare. If I were to double this and go to 1024, it should be a higher quality shadow. I can render, and I can save, and let's see if it made a difference. It still doesn't look very good. So you can see the difference it's making though by panning back between the two of them. This first one was a lot more pixelated. The second one is still fairly pixelated, but it's definitely a little bit of an improvement. It's a cleaner image, but it's still a really hard edge. I'll save that. So I'll leave that at 1024, and let's go down a little bit, and let's just mess with the filter size and the bias. So if I change the filter size first, right now it's at 1. Let's say I put it at 3, and we'll see if that does anything for us. All right, and then I'll save. So here, you can see by changing the filter size, we've softened up the shadow a little bit on the edges. So at least it's starting to get a little bit softer, and that looks a little bit nicer. So what happens if I bump that up to, say, 5, and then I click render? And here you can start to see the shadow getting a little bit softer. So here's kind of our progression. We started out at 0 with our 512. We went to 1024. Then we changed our filter size to 3 and then to 5. And you can see what's happening on the edges right here on your cube. So at least that's starting to look a little bit better for us. Still not great. So let's say I were to keep it at 5 and I want to bump my bias up a little bit. Right now my bias is at 0.001. Let's just put it at 0.5 and see what that looks like. So you'll notice that by bumping up your bias, you're actually going to remove where that shadow is coming from. Since I made such a drastic improvement to it, I've completely gotten rid of my shadow. So let me bump this way down and see if we can kind of see exactly what this is going to do so you guys can get an idea. There we go. So I bumped that bias down. I didn't think 0.5 would completely get rid of it. Now I have it at 0.088. And you can kind of see how it's offsetting that shadow a little bit. So if I save this image and we filter between these two, you can see that change that's happening. That's what bias will do for you. Really not all that helpful as far as what you guys would need for this. So I wanted you to see it, but we're not going to take that right off. And I would put my bias back at like 0.001 or whatever it was. So that's some basics on what depth map shadows can do. But a little bit more flexibility can be had with these Raytrace shadows. Right at the beginning, we went into render settings, we turned on Raytrace. That's because I wanted us to play around with our Raytrace shadows a little bit. So in here, if I just click a render, which we've actually already really rendered it with the Raytrace, you can see we get that really hard edge. It's a nice clean edge though, which is great. It's a higher resolution than what that depth map shadow is giving us. The issue right now is that it's just extremely hard on that side. So if I were to save this image so we can use it as reference, I'll close this out, and now we can make some changes. So we have our light radius here. You'll see you can kind of bump your light radius up all the way to number 1. So let's say I want to put it at 0.5, and let's see what changes that'll make for us here. So if I bump my light radius up to 0.5, you'll notice that it actually does soften the edge up really nicely, but it's got a lot of noise, which means that it's really pixelated. So even though it's a softer edge, it doesn't look good at all. So I'm going to save that, and we can use it as reference. So I'll keep that at 0.5, and let's take our shadow rays, and if you bump that up, you can see you can go up to 40 shadow rays. Let's not go that high yet. Let's just start at 10 and see what type of changes we get compared to the 0 that we were originally at. Okay, so you can see what it looks like at 10 shadow rays, and I'll save that. And here's our differences. So this was our first ray trace image with 0 for everything. Then we bumped up our light radius to 0.5, but kept our shadow rays at 0. And we had this softer image, but it was extremely noisy and pixelated. Next, we kept our light radius the same, but bumped our shadow rays up to 10. And you can see it's starting to soften out a little bit for me here. So let's bump that up even more and see what it's going to look like. Let's go to 20. So the other thing you're going to notice though is every time I bump up any of these settings, like my shadow rays or anything, it's going to slow down my render time. So that's kind of the game that you need to play when it comes to modeling and lighting and texturing, is that the more detail that you're adding into this thing, the longer it's going to take per frame. Now we really don't have anything going on right now, so it's going to render fairly quick. But when you have larger scenes created, you really need to be careful with that. So let's save this image. You can kind of see the differences that we're starting to get. So here was a 0. Here we had just bumped up our light radius, and now we're starting to get a cleaner shadow. And you can see that this was at 10 shadow rays, and this one here is at 20 shadow rays. And this is at least giving us a nice softer edge on the outside. It's a cleaner, higher resolution type image, and it's working fairly well. So we'll save that. So just for fun, I'll bump this up a little bit higher, but I don't want to go too high. It's going to take a little longer to actually register it. And we'll render this out at 30. So as that's starting to render, you can see that the image is just getting a little bit cleaner with the more shadow rays that we're adding in. So let's save that, and we can compare it. So it's going to be a little tougher to see the differences now. So you can kind of see it, especially right here on the cube. You can see the difference between 20 shadow rays and 30. 20 and 30. And you can see the noise on the outside just get a little bit cleaner as well. It's very minimal, so it might be tough to see. But if you look close, you can kind of see the change between the two. But compared to what we started with, this is really hard edge, and then this really noisy pixelated edge. Oop, where'd it go? There it is. We've made some drastic improvements already. Our render time's still fairly low, and we've got a pretty nice looking shadow that's kind of taking place here. So I'd be happy with that for right now. And that is really just like a really basic lighting demo that I wanted to give, on top of doing some UVs and stuff like that. We're going to go into more in depth with lighting and with UVs and texturing a little bit later on in this whole lesson. This tutorial was really just to introduce how to apply them, how to do some basic adjustments to them so you can start to see what changes they're going to make for you. So I know that that was a longer tutorial. Hopefully you took something away from it. We covered a lot of different topics, which is good. And I think that they'll really help you. They'll really help you if you really got into more of the modeling texturing side. They'll help you just kind of learn more of a basic way to go about everything, rather than all these new shortcuts that Maya has since created for us, which is great. It helps you be more efficient, it helps speed up your process, but it is still nice to kind of learn how to ride a bike with training wheels before you take them off, and that's what we kind of wanted to do today. So next tutorial we'll be talking about some other options, and then we will get back into lighting a little bit later on, and UV mapping, because we will eventually be UV mapping more of like a human figure. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Hopefully you guys learned something from this, and I will talk with you soon.